Welcome to the ultimate city guide of Istanbul, Strolling Through Istanbul, all in 360 virtual reality. Before we start our strolling through the streets of Istanbul, quite obviously we have to talk about the history of the city. So let's start with the first chapter, the view from the bridge. A poet writing 14 centuries ago described the city as being surrounded by a garland of waters. Much has changed since then. But modern Istanbul still owes much of its spirit and beauty to the waters which bound and divided. There is perhaps nowhere else in town where one can appreciate this more than from the Galata Bridge, where all tours of the city should begin. There are other places in Istanbul with more panoramic views, but none where one can better sense the intimacy which the city has with the sea, nor better understand how its maritime situation has influenced its character and its history. So the visitor is advised to stroll to the Galata Bridge for his first view of the city. But you should do your sightseeing there as do the Istanbulers. Seated at a tea house or cafe on the lower level of the bridge, enjoying your cave over a cup of tea or a glass of rakı, looking out along the Golden Horn to where it meets the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. Istanbul is the only city in the world which stands upon two continents. The main part of the city, which is located at the southeastern tip of Europe, is separated from its suburbs in Asia by the incomparable Bosphorus. The Golden Horn then divides the European city into two parts, the old imperial town of Istanbul on the right bank and the port quarter of Galata on the left, with the more modern residential districts on the hills above Galata and along the European shore of the lower Bosphorus. Istanbul itself forms a more or less triangular promontory bounded on the north of the Golden Horn, on the south by the Sea of Marmara, the ancient Propontis. At Saray Point, the apex of this promontory, the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn flow together into the Marmara, forming a site of great beauty. So it must have appeared to Jason and the Argonauts when they sailed across the Propontis 3,000 years ago in search of the Golden Fleece. And so it still appears today to the tourists approaching the city on a modern ocean liner. According to tradition, the original settlement from which the city grew was established on the Acropolis above Saray Point in the 7th century BC. Although there are evidences that the site was inhabited much earlier than that, the legendary founder of the town of Byzantium was Byzas the Megarian, who established a colony on the Acropolis in the year 667 BC. We are told that Byzas had consulted the Delphic oracle, who advised him to settle opposite the land of the blind. The oracle was referring to the residents of Chalcedon, a Greek colony which had been established some years before across the strait. The implication is that the Chalcedonians must have been blind not to have appreciated the much greater advantages of the site chosen by Byzas. Situated at the mouth of the Bosphorus, it was in position to control all shipping from the Black Sea, the ancient Pontus, through to the Pontonus of the Aegean, while its position on the boundary of Europe and Asia eventually attracted to it the great land roads of both continents. Moreover, surrounded as it is on the sides by water, its short landward exposure defended by strong walls, it could be made impregnable to attack. As the French writer Gilles concluded 4 centuries ago, it seems to me that while other cities might be mortal, this one will remain as long as there are men on earth. From the very beginning of its history, Byzantium was an important center of trade and commerce, and was noted for its wine and fisheries. Not all of the wine was exported, apparently, for in antiquity the citizens of Byzantium had the reputation to being confirmed tipplers. Menander, in his comedy The Flute Girl, tells us that Byzantium makes all of her merchants suds. Says one of the Byzantine characters in his play, "I booze it all the night, and upon my waking after my doze, I feel that I have no less than 3 heads upon my shoulders." The character of a city is formed quite early in its career. During its first millennium, Byzantium had much the same history as the other Greek cities in and on the edge of Asia Minor. The city was taken by Darius in the year 512 BC and remained under Persian control until 479 BC, when it was recaptured by the Spartan general Pausanias. Byzantium later became part of the Athenian Empire, although it revolted in 440 and again in 411. It was reconquered on each occasion by the Athenians, the last time by Alcibiades. After the defeat of Athens in 403, Byzantium was captured by Lysander and was still under a Spartan governor when Xenophon's 10,000 arrived shortly afterwards. Xenophon and his men were so inhospitably treated that in retaliation they occupied the town, leaving only after they exacted a large bribe from its citizens. During the first half of the 4th century BC, Byzantium was held in enforced alliances with Athens. But in the year 356 BC, the city rebelled and won its independence. Despite this, the Athenians, through the urgencies of Demosthenes, sent aid to Byzantium when it was besieged by Philip of Macedon in 340 BC. A contemporary Athenian writer informs us that the Byzantine commanders were forced to build taverns within the very defense walls in order to keep their tipsy soldiers at their posts. But the Byzantines fought well, for they successfully held off the Macedonians in a memorable siege. Despite their spirited fight against King Philip, the Byzantines had enough good sense not to resist his son, Alexander the Great. Soon after Alexander's victory at the Battle of the Granisius in 334 BC, Byzantium capitulated and opened its gates to the Macedonians. Later, after Alexander's death in 323 BC, Byzantium was involved in the events following on the collapse and dismemberment of the empire and dismemberment of his empire and the subsequent eastward expansion of Europe. In the year 179 BC, the city was captured by the combined forces of Rhodes, Pergamum, and Bithynia. A century later, Byzantium was a pawn in the struggle between Rome and Mithridates, king of Pontus. After the final victory of Rome, Byzantium became its client state, and thereafter enjoyed nearly 3 centuries of quiet prosperity under the mantle of the Pax Romana. But eventually, in the closing years of the 2nd century AD, Byzantium was swept up once again in the tides of history. At that time, Byzantium found itself on the losing side in a civil war and was besieged by the Emperor Septimus Severus. After finally taking Byzantium in the year 196 AD, the emperor tore down the city walls, massacred the soldiers and officials who had opposed him, and left the town in a smoldering ruin. A few years afterwards, however, Septimus realized that the imprudence of leaving such a strategic site undefended and then rebuilt the city and its walls. The walls of Septimus Severus are thought to have begun at the Golden Horn, a short distance downstream from the present site of the Galata bridge, and to have ended at the Marmara, somewhere near where the lighthouse now stands. The area thus enclosed was more than double that of the ancient town of Byzantium, which had comprised little more than the Acropolis itself. At the beginning of the 4th century AD, Byzantium was profoundly affected by the climatic events then taking place in the Roman Empire. After the retirement of the Emperor Diocletian in the year 305, his successors in the Tetrarchy, the 2 co-emperors, and their Caesars fought bitterly with one another for the control of the empire. This struggle was eventually won by Constantine, Emperor of the West, who in the year 324 finally defeated Licinius, Emperor of the East. The last battle took in the hills above Chrysopolis, just across the Bosporus from Byzantium. On the following day, the 18th September in the year AD 324, Byzantium surrendered and opened its gates to Constantine, now sole ruler of the Roman Empire. During the first 2 years of his victory, Constantine conceived the grand scheme which would affect world history for the next millennium: the re-establishment of the Roman Empire with Byzantium as its capital. After he made his decision, Constantine set out to rebuild and enlarge and adorn the old town to suit his imperial role. Work began on 4th November in the year 326, when the emperor personally traced out the limits of the new city. The defense wall, with which Constantine enclosed the city on the landward side, began at the point on the Golden Horn, somewhat upstream from the present Atatürk Bridge, and extended to the Sea of Marmara in a greater circular arc, ending in the Bay of Samatya. Constantine's city was thus more than 5 times as large as the town of Septimus Severus, and it was to be infinitely more grand. The imperial building program proceeded rapidly, and in less than 4 years the new capital was completed. On the 11th May in the year AD 330, in a ceremony in the Hippodrome, Constantine decided the city of New Rome, soon after to be called Constantinople. 3 years thence, the old town of Byzantium would have been 1,000 years old. During the century following the reign of Constantine, the city grew rapidly and soon expanded beyond the limits set by its founder. In the first half of the 5th century, during the reign of Theodosius II, a new and much stronger line of defense walls was built near a mile further out into Thrace, replacing the older walls of Constantine. These walls have delimited the size of the old city up to the present day, so that subsequent expansion was restricted to the suburban districts along the Marmara, the Golden Horn and the Bosporus. The area thus enclosed included 7 hills, the same number as in Old Rome, a matter of some mystical significance in Byzantium. Although the contours of these hills have been obscured by modern roads and buildings, they can still be discerned and form convenient reference points for studying the old city. 6 of the 7 hills can be seen from the Galata Bridge, marching in stately line down the Golden Horn, each of them crowned with Byzantine church or an Ottoman mosque, giving imperial quality to the skyline of Istanbul. Great changes took place in the Roman Empire in the 2 centuries following the reign of Constantine the Great. After the death of Theodosius I in 395, the empire was divided between his 2 sons, with Honorius ruling the west from Rome and Arcadius the east with his capital at Constantinople. The western part of the empire was overrun by barbarians during the following century, and in the year 476 the last emperor of the west was deposed, leaving the emperor in Constantinople sole ruler of what was left of the empire. This soon brought about a profound change in the character of the empire, for it was now centered in lands populated largely by Greek-speaking Christians. And so, although Latin remained the official language of the court up until the beginning of the 6th century, the empire was becoming more and more Greek and Christian in character and began to sever its connections with the classical traditions of Athens and Rome. As a great churchman, Gennadius was to write in later times, "Though I am a Hellene by speech, yet I would never say that I was Hellene, for I do not believe as Hellenes believe. I should like to take my name from my faith, and if anyone asks me what I am, I answer a Christian. Though my father dwelt in Thessaly, I do not call myself a Thessalian, but a Byzantine, for I am of Byzantium." A new epoch in the city's history began during the reign of Justinian the Great, who succeeded to the throne in the year 527. 5 years after the accession, Justinian was very nearly overthrown by an insurrection of the factions in the Hippodrome, the famous Nika revolt, which was finally crushed only after widespread destruction and terrible loss of life. Immediately after the suppression of the revolt, Justinian set out to rebuild the city on an even grander scale than before. When he had finished his reconstruction, only a few years later, the city of Constantinople was the greatest and most magnificent metropolis on earth, an imperial capital beginning the first of its golden ages. The crowning glory of Justinian's new city was the resurrected church of Hagia Sophia, whose venerable form can still be seen on the Acropolis, a symbol of the ancient city of which it was so long the heart. During the course of Justinian's reign, his generals succeeded in reconquering many of the lost dominions of the Roman Empire, and by the time he died in 565, the borders of Byzantium stretched from the Euphrates to the Pillars of Hercules. But the Golden Age did not last long, for within a half century after the death of Justinian, his empire had fallen apart, assaulted from without by the Lombards, Slavs, Avars, and Persians, ravaged from within by anarchy, plague, and social unrest. The empire was saved from total destruction by the emperor Heraclius, who ruled from 610 till 641. In a series of brilliant campaigns, Heraclius defeated the Persians, the Avars, and the Slavs, and succeeded in regaining much of the territory which had been lost in the previous half-century. Shortly after the death of Heraclius, however, much of the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire was overrun by the Arabs. Each on several occasions in the 7th and 8th centuries besieged Constantinople itself. But Byzantium held off the Arab advance and prevented them from gaining a foothold in Eastern Europe, just as they were finally stopped at about the same time in the West by Charles Martel. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire was invaded by the Bulgars, who gained control of large areas of the Balkans and twice laid siege on Constantinople. But on both occasions, they were defeated by the great Theodosian land walls, which continued to shelter Byzantium from its enemies across the centuries. Despite these numerous wars, Byzantium was still strong and basically sound as late as the middle of the 11th century, controlling an empire which stretched from western Persia through Asia Minor and the Balkans to southern Italy. But then in the year 1071, the Byzantine army, led by Romanus IV, suffered a catastrophic defeat by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert, and much of eastern Asia Minor was permanently lost to the empire. In the same year, the Normans captured Bari, thus bringing to an end Byzantine rule in Italy. The forces were now gathering, which would eventually destroy the empire. A decade after these defeats, Alexius Comnenus ascended the throne of Byzantium. For the next century, he and his successors, the illustrious dynasty of the Comneni, successfully defended the empire against the attacks of its numerous enemies. During that period, the empire was being subjected to increasing pressure of the Latins of Western Europe, whose armies first passed through Asia Minor in the year 1097 during the First Crusade. As time went on, it became increasingly apparent that the Latins were less interested in freeing the Holy Land from the Saracens than they were in seizing land and wealth for themselves. And the prize which attracted them most was the rich and magnificent city of Constantinople. By the time the Comneni destiny came to an end in the year 1185, the Normans had already captured Thessalonica and were advancing towards the capital. 2 decades later, in the year 1203, the Latin armies of the Fourth Crusade made their first assault upon Constantinople. Although they were not able to take the city at that time, they did so in the second attack of the following year. On April the 13th, 1204, the Crusaders breached the sea walls along the Golden Horn and took the city by storm. They then proceeded to ruin and sack Constantinople, stripping it of its wealth, its art treasures, and its sacred relics, most of which were shipped off to Western Europe. As wrote the French knight Villehardon, describing the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders, "Of holy relics, I need only to say that it contained more than all Christendom combined. There is no estimating the quantity of gold, silver, rich stuffs, and other vulnerable things. The production of all the climates of the world. It is the belief of me, Geoffrey of Villehardon, Marshal of Champagne, that the plunder of the city exceeded all that had been witnessed since the creation of the world." And that as the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates wrote in his lament, "O city, city, eye of all cities, subject of narratives all over the world, supporter of churches, leader of faith, and guide of orthodoxy, protector of education, abode of all good, thou hast drunk to the dregs the cup of the anger of the Lord. and has been visited with fire fiercer than that which in days of the descendant upon the Pentapolis. The Latin kings ruled in Constantinople from 1204 till 1261, at which time Michael Palaiologos succeeded in recapturing the city and restoring the Byzantine Empire. But the empire was now only a fragment of what it had been in former days, comprising parts of Thrace, Macedonia, and the Peloponnesus, which most of its former possessions in Asia Minor occupied by the Ottoman Turks, and much of its land in Europe lost to the rapacious Latins. Within the next century of these dominions were lost as the Turks crossed over into Europe and advanced far into the Balkans. By the beginning of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople and its immediate suburbs, with the old city decaying within the great walls which had protected it for so long. Nevertheless, the indomitable Byzantines hung on for another half-century, fighting off several attempts by the Turks to take the capital. But by the middle of the 15th century, it became increasingly obvious that the city could not hold out much longer, for it was then completely surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. On the 13th February 1451, the young Sultan Mehmet II ascended to the Ottoman throne and almost immediately began preparations for what would be the final siege of the city. During the summer of the following year, 1452, he constructed the fortress of Rumelihisar on the Bosphorus, just across the narrow straits from the Turkish fortress of Anadoluhisar, which had been built in the previous century by Sultan Bayezid I. The two fortresses thus completely cut off Constantinople from the Black Sea, the first step in the blockade of the capital. In March of 1453, the Ottoman navy sailed into the Sea of Marmara, cutting off Byzantium from the west and completing the blockade. Then in the first week of April in that year, Sultan Mehmet massed his armies in Thrace and marched them into position before the land walls of the city, thus beginning a siege which was to last for 7 weeks. The Byzantines and the Italians' allies, who were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, defended the city valiantly, until their strength and resources were nearly gone. Finally, on the 29th May of 1453, the Turks forced their way through a breach in the shattered land walls and poured into the city. Constantine XI Dragazes, the last Byzantine emperor, fought on bravely with his men until he was killed on the walls of his fallen city, thus bringing to an heroic end the long and illustrious history of Byzantium. According to the custom of the age, Sultan Mehmet, now called Fatih or the Conqueror, gave over the city to his soldiers to pillage for 3 days after it was captured. Immediately afterwards, the Sultan began to restore the city, repairing the damage it has sustained during the siege and in the decades of decay before the conquest. A year or so later, Sultan Mehmet constructed a palace on the third hill, on the site of which the Bayezid Fire Tower now stands. Some years afterwards, he built a second and more extensive palace, the Topkapı Sarayı, whose domes and spires still adorn the first hill, the ancient acropolis of the city. By 1470, he had completed the great mosque which bears his name, Fatih Cami, the Mosque of the Conqueror. His mosque, which was comparable in size of Hagia Sophia, was the center of a whole complex of pious foundations, religious and philanthropic institutions of one sort or another. Many of Fatih's viziers followed his example, building mosques and pious foundations of their own, each of which soon became the center of its local neighborhood, together developing into the new Muslim town of Istanbul. Fatih also repeopled the city, which had lost much of its population in the decades preceding to the conquest, bringing in Turks, Greeks, and Armenians from Asia Minor and Thrace, settling them in Istanbul and Galata. Later in that century, large numbers of Jewish refugees from Spain were welcomed to the empire by Fatih's son and successor Bayezid II, and many of them settled in Istanbul. By the beginning of the 16th century, then Istanbul was a thriving and populous city, once again the capital of a vast empire. During the century after the conquest, the Turkish army swept victoriously through the Balkans and the Near East, and its buccaneering navies dominated the Mediterranean. By the middle of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Baghdad in the east to Algiers in the west, and from Lower Egypt to the southern borders of Russia, rivaling in extent the Byzantine Empire in the days of Justinian. The empire reached the peak of its power during the reign of Süleyman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 till 1566. Süleyman personally led his armies in dozen victorious campaigns, failing only in his attempts to take Vienna and Corfu, which thereafter set the limit to the Turkish expansion to the north and west in Europe. The loot from these campaigns and the tribute and taxes from the conquered territories enormously enriched the empire, and much of its wealth was used by Süleyman and his viziers to adorn Istanbul with mosques, palaces, and pious foundations. The grandest and most beautiful of these structures was the Süleymaniye, the mosque which was completed for Süleyman in the year 1557 by his chief architect, the great Sinan. This magnificent edifice stands on the crest of the ridge above the Golden Horn to the west of Istanbul, and of the Galata Bridge, dominating the whole skyline of the city. The Süleymaniye is a symbol of the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, just as Hagia Sophia represents the triumph of Byzantium in the days of Justinian. These two great buildings, separated in foundations by more than 1,000 years of history, stand only a mile apart in Istanbul. Looking at them both at once from the Galata Bridge, we are reminded that this old town was twice the capital of a world empire. This second golden age lasted longer than did the first, for the Ottoman Empire was still vigorous and expanding as late as the middle of the 17th century, 100 years after the death of Süleyman. But by that time, signs of decadence were already apparent in the empire. During the century after Süleyman, the Ottoman armies and navies suffered several defeats, and territory was lost in Transylvania, Hungary, and Persia. There were also symptoms of decay within the empire, whose subjects, both Muslims and Christians, were suffering from the maladministration and corruption which had spread to all levels of the government. One of the principal causes of this decay was to be found in the Sultanate itself. For successors of Süleyman ceased to lead their armies in the field, preferring to spend their time with their women in the harem. By the end of the 16th century, the empire was literally ruled by these women, the mothers of the sultans or their favorite concubines, who ran the country to satisfy their own personal ends, to its great detriment. The situation seemed to improve for a time during the reign of Sultan Murad IV, who ruled from 1623 to 1640. The young sultan, who was only 14 when he ascended the throne, proved to be a strong and able ruler, and checked for a time the decline of the Ottoman Empire. He was the first sultan since Süleyman to lead his army in battle and was victorious in several campaigns, climaxed by the recapture of Baghdad in 1638. But Murad's untimely death at the age of 30 ended this brief revival of the old martial Ottoman spirit. And after his reign, the decay proceeded even more rapidly than before. Nevertheless, the Ottoman Empire was still vast and prosperous, and some of its institutions remained basically sound, so that it held together for centuries after it had passed its prime. And although the Ottoman army suffered one defeat after another in the Balkans, Istanbul was little affected, for the frontiers were far away and wealth continued to pour into the capital. Members of the royal family and the great and wealthy men and women of the empire continued to adorn the city with splendid mosques and pious foundations, while the sultan continued to take his pleasures in the harem. But by the end of the 18th century, the fortunes of the empire had declined to the point where its basic problems could no longer be ignored, not even in the palace. The empire gave up large portions of its Balkan territories in humiliating peace treaties after losing wars with European powers. Within the empire was weakened by anarchy and rebellion, and its people were suffering even more grievously than before. This led to social and political unrest, particularly among the subject Christians, who now began to nourish dreams of independence. During this period, the Ottoman Empire was being increasingly influenced by developments in Western Europe, particularly by the liberal ideas which brought about the French revolutions. This eventually led to a movement of reform in the Ottoman Empire. The first sultan to be deeply influenced by these Western ideas was Selim III, who ruled from 1789 till 1807. Selim attempted to improve and modernize the Ottoman army by reorganizing and training it according to Western models. By this he hoped to protect the empire from further encroachments by foreign powers and from rebellion and anarchy within its own borders. But Selim's efforts were resisted and eventually frustrated by the Janissaries, the elite corps of the old Ottoman army, who felt that their privilege were being threatened by the new reforms. The Janissaries were finally crushed in 1826 by Sultan Mahmud II, who thereupon instituted an extensive program of reforms in all of the basic institutions of the empire, reshaping them along modern Western lines. This program continued for a time during the reigns of Mahmud's immediate successors, Abdülmecid and Abdül Aziz. The reform movement, or Tanzimat, as it was called, culminated in 1876 with the promulgation of the first Ottoman constitution and the establishment of a parliament, which met for the first time in the 19th March of the following year. But this parliament was very short-lived, for it was dissolved on the 13th February of 1878 by Sultan Abdülhamid II. Then in the second year of his long and oppressive reign, nevertheless, the forces of reform had now grown too strong to be held down permanently. The pressures they generated eventually led in 1909 to the deposition of Abdülhamid, to the restoration of the constitution and the parliament in that same year. But the next decade, which seemed so full of promise at its beginning, was a sad and bitter one for Turkey. The country found itself on the losing side in the First World War, after which the victorious allies proceeded to divide up the remnants of the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves. Turkey was saved only by the heroic efforts of its people, who fought to preserve their homeland when it was invaded by the Greeks in 1919. The leader in this war of independence, which was finally won by Turkey in 1922, was Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later to be known as Atatürk, the father of the Turks. Even before the conclusion of the war, Atatürk and his associates had laid the foundations of the new republic, which would arise out of its ruins of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922, and on October 29 of the following year, the Republic of Turkey was formally established, with Kemal Atatürk as its first president. During the remaining 15 years of his life, Atatürk guided his countrymen to a more modern and Western way of life, a process which still continues in Turkey today. Kemal Atatürk died on 10th of November 1938, profoundly mourned by his people then and revered by them still as the father of their country. At the time of the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923, the Anatolian city of Ankara was chosen as the capital and the seat of parliament. Soon afterwards, the embassies of the great European powers packed up and moved to new quarters in Ankara, leaving their old mansions along the Grand Rue Pera in Istanbul. And so, for the first time in 16th centuries, Istanbul was no longer the capital of an empire. Now, half a century later, history would seem to have passed Istanbul by, and no longer do wealthy and powerful emperors adorn her with splendid buildings. The old town is now ruining down at the heels, some say, living on her memories. But what memories they are! Many monuments of the city's imperial past can be seen from the Galata Bridge, particularly those which stand on the 6 hills among the long Golden Horn. On the first hill, the ancient Acropolis of Byzantium. We see the gardens and pavilions of Topkapı Saray and the great church of Hagia Sophia, framed by its 4 minarets. The most prominent monument on the second hill is the Baroque Nur Osmaniye Cami, while the third hill is crowned by the Süleymaniye, surrounded by the clustering domes of its pious foundations. On the foreshore between those 2 hills we see Yeni Cami, the large mosque which stands at the Istanbul end of the Galata Bridge, and Rüstem Pasha Cami, the smaller mosque which is located in the market district just to the west. The third and fourth hills are joined by the Roman aqueducts of Valens, But to see this, we must bestir ourselves from our seat on the Galata bridge and walk some distance upon the Golden Horn towards the inner span, the Atatürk Bridge. The fourth hill is surmounted by Fatih Cami, the Mosque of the Conqueror, whose domes and minarets can be seen in the middle distance some way in from the Golden Horn. Atop the fifth hill, on the edge of the ridge above the Golden Horn, stand the Mosque of Sultan Selim the Grim. Far off in the distance we can see the minarets of Mihrimah Cami, which stands on the summit of the sixth hill. A mile inland from the Golden Horn and just inside the Theodosian walls, across the Golden Horn, the skyline is dominated by the huge, conical-caped Galata Tower, the last remnants of the medieval Geronese town of Galata. Looking down the Golden Horn to where it joins the Bosphorus and flows into the Marmara, we see the fabled Maiden's Tower, the little island watchtower which stands at the confluence of the city's garland of waters. Beyond on the Aegean shore, the afternoon sun is reflected in the windows of Üsküdar, anciently called Chrysopolis, the city of gold. Farther to the south, out of sight from our vantage point on the Galata Bridge, is the Anatolian suburb of Kadıköy, the ancient Chalcedon, settled a decade or so before Byzantium. Sipping our tea or raka in our cafe on the Galata Bridge, we rest our eyes once more on the grey and ruined beautiful of Istanbul, crowded with imperial monuments on its 7 ancient hills. At times, thanks for staying with me until the end. But before starting the tour, it was important to share the history of the city. The second chapter of Strolling Through Istanbul is called From the Galata Bridge to the Hagia Sophia, which will be a virtual walk all in 360 through the streets of Istanbul with many things to see. Don't forget to subscribe and see ya!